Usually when we talk about like historical or literary analysis, there's this expectation of precision. It's almost like engineering.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, clean, binary. We really like our history to be this visible, neatly categorized timeline that is just easy to digest.
Right, exactly. But then you step into the world of ancient Greco-Roman political satire, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just completely broken.
Yeah.
I mean, we are looking at a literary landscape that is murky, chaotic, aggressively bawdy, and frankly, hilarious. But that chaos is exactly what makes it so brilliantly effective at diagnosing the actual societal diseases of its time.
Which brings us to the core mission for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
If you are prepping for the UGC NET exam, you have to navigate this exact chaos. So we are jumping straight into Chapter 1 of British Literature Unlocked by Ankit Sharma.
A fantastic resource.
Oh, absolutely essential. And our target today is the undisputed master of old comedy and political satire himself, Aristophanes.
Before we go any further, I mean, we really need to define what old comedy actually means. Because it's not just, ancient stand-up.
Right.
In 5th century Athens, old comedy was a highly topical, fantastical, and chorus-driven spectacle. It was a civic institution. Think of it as a space where a playwright could brutally critique powerful politicians, intellectuals, and, well, the ongoing wars without being executed for treason. It was kind of the only safe medium for radical political critique.
It's like the ancient equivalent of the court jester being the only person allowed to mock the king.
Exactly.
And to anchor everything you need to know for the exam, let's establish a foundational theme right now. Think of it as your Aristophanes code. Okay, let's unpack this. The code is Old Aristo satirizes Athens.
I like that. Whenever you see his name, instantly associate him with that idea. Old comedy and political satire targeting Athenian society.
And his major works, the ones you have to remember.
Right, so that's the Knights, the Clouds, the Wasps, the Frogs, and Lysistrata. They are all basically variations of this exact weapon. But today, we are going to explore exactly how he wielded that weapon by breaking down 2 specific plays.
And to connect them, we have a work code for you to keep in mind throughout this deep dive. Here it is, Clouds corrupt argument. Lysistrata corrects war.
That is the intellectual bridge we are crossing today.
Yeah, so let's start with the first half, the Clouds, and how it attacks the internal moral rot of Athens.
So The Clouds, which was first produced around 423 BC, is widely considered the world's first extant comedy of ideas. But what makes it a crucial text for your exam is that it is a direct, brutal attack on the new intellectual fashion of the day, which was sophistry.
Right.
And to put a face to this dangerous new trend, Aristophanes chose the philosopher Socrates. Now, keep in mind, we are just breaking down Aristophanes' satirical viewpoint here for the exam, not taking a stance on the actual historical figures.
Whoops. So let's look at the mechanics of the story first. We have our plot code for the Clouds, which is debt leads to thinkery, leads to clouds, leads to arguments, leads to creditors, leads to beating, leads to burning.
That's a perfect sequence to memorize. Debt, thinkery, clouds, argument wins, father burns.
Exactly. It revolves around a father named Strepsiades. He is this old traditional guy tossing and turning in bed because he is absolutely drowning in debt. And the debt comes from his son, Phidippides, who is utterly obsessed with expensive chariot racing.
Which was incredibly expensive back then.
Right. To put this in modern terms, Phidippides is like a kid who blew the family's entire life savings on terrible cryptocurrency investments.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
Yeah, and now the dad is desperately looking for legal loopholes to just avoid bankruptcy.
He is desperate. So Strepsiades wants his son to enroll in a place called the Thinkery, which is the school run by Socrates in the play.
Yeah.
Why? Because in the Thinkery, they teach the art of sophistry.
Now, we need to explain exactly how sophistry worked and why it was so terrifying to traditional Athenians. Because in Athenian democracy, the courts and the public assemblies were, well, they were everything.
They were the center of power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you could persuade people with your words, you had absolute power. The sophists were essentially traveling teachers who claimed they could teach anyone how to make the weaker, inferior argument defeat the stronger, superior argument.
Right. It wasn't about finding objective truth. Not at all. It was just about winning. If we use a modern analogy, the Thinkery is basically a social media algorithm.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It doesn't care about what is factually true or morally right. It only optimizes for engagement, manipulation, and winning the argument at any cost. So Strepsiades wants his son to learn this algorithm so they can verbally manipulate their angry creditors in court and just not pay back their debts.
But the son, Pheidippides, is basically an arrogant frat boy who thinks this school is completely beneath him. He just refuses to go. So the old man, Strepsiades, decides he will enroll himself. And this is where we meet Aristophanes' version of Socrates. And I have to push back here for a second, because the historical Socrates, the one Plato writes about, was famously obsessed with finding absolute truth and virtue, right? Like he was eventually executed for it. Is Aristophanes just completely slandering the guy here?
What's fascinating here is that this is actually one of the greatest historical debates surrounding this play. Plato actually claimed later that the clouds heavily contributed to the public prejudice that got Socrates executed.
Wow.
But what Aristophanes is doing here is using Socrates as a recognizable, famous face to represent the entire movement of new intellectualism. It's a caricature. He strips away all reverence and introduces Socrates as this absurd comic figure.
He literally introduces him suspended overhead in a basket at the end of a rope. He claims he needs to be up there to properly observe meteorological phenomena. It is the ultimate literal head in the clouds joke.
It really is. And inside the Thinkery, they aren't debating virtue. Not at all. They are doing absurdly petty pseudoscience. They are measuring exactly how far a flea can jump by dipping its feet in melted wax to make tiny wax shoes?
Tiny wax shoes.
Yes, and then they take them off and measure the distance. Or they are debating whether a gnat buzzes from its mouth or its rear end. It's just a complete mockery of intellectualism.
Which brings us to the actual chorus of the play, and this is an exam essential. The chorus is the clouds themselves. They arrive singing majestically, but they are revealed to be the patron goddesses of these idle thinkers, sophists, and charlatans.
Because, just like clouds, these intellectuals produce nothing but mist and shifting shapes. There's no substance.
Right. So Socrates tries to teach old Strepsiades, but the man is just too old, too crude, and too stuck in his traditional ways. So Socrates eventually kicks him out.
Desperate, Strepsiades finally forces his son, Pheidippides, to join the Thinkery instead.
Wait, so the dad sends his kid to basically learn how to lie out of debt. How does that not backfire immediately?
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
And here is where the play shifts from absurd comedy into a much darker philosophical warning. If you are taking notes for the UGC NET, this is the central conflict you absolutely must know. The core debate of the play is personified on stage by two characters, right argument versus wrong argument.
They literally physically debate over who gets to educate the boy.
Right.
Right.
Right argument, which is sometimes translated as superior argument, stands for traditional morality, discipline, justice, and the old ways that built Athens. Wrong argument, or inferior argument, denies that justice even exists. It offers a life of pleasure, ease, and using linguistic trickery to just talk your way out of any consequence.
And wrong argument wins.
Yep.
Because he points to the audience and proves that all the people in the most powerful political positions in Athens were schooled by wrong arguments.
Yeah.
So Pheidippides gets the corrupt education. And at first, the plan works perfectly.
Sure does.
The angry creditors show up, and the father and son use their new linguistic trickery to confuse them and dismiss them entirely.
But here is the mechanism of how society rots from the inside. You cannot introduce a philosophy that destroys objective truth and expect it to only hurt your enemies. The father and son throw a celebration, they get into a dispute, and Pheidippides brutally beats his own father.
And the physical beating isn't even the worst part.
No.
The true horror is that Pheidippides uses the exact sophistic logic his father forced him to learn to logically, calmly justify why a son has the moral right to beat his father. He completely talks circles around the old man, dismantling the very concept of familial respect, and then he threatens to go inside and beat his mother too.
Strepsiades finally realizes his massive mistake. The immoral algorithm he sought out to cheat his debts has now destroyed his own family. So he flies into a rage, arms his slaves, and physically attacks and burns down the Thinkery, chasing Socrates and the intellectuals off stage.
Wow. Okay, so for the exam, let's explicitly map the sequential flow of the clouds so you don't fall for any traps.
Good idea.
It starts with debt, which leads the father to the Thinkery, where they meet the clouds. This leads to the debate of arguments, which they use to defeat the creditors. But that directly causes the beating of the father, which culminates in the burning of the school. Debt to Thinkery, argument to burning. That is your narrative arc.
Exactly. And the core exam traps you need to remember, it satirizes Socrates and sophistic education. The school is the Thinkery. The central conflict is right argument versus wrong argument. And it ends violently with the attack on the Thinkery. It shows how false intellectualism corrupts society from the inside out.
Which brings us perfectly to the second half of our thesis. Clouds corrupt argument. Lysistrata corrects war. If the Clouds shows how a society rots internally through corrupt ideas, Lysistrata, which was written about 12 years later in 411 BC, shows what happens when that internal rot manifests into an external catastrophe.
Let's move to the Peloponnesian War. The historical context here is absolutely vital. The Peloponnesian War was this devastating, decades-long meat grinder of a conflict between Athens and Sparta. By the time Aristophanes wrote Lysistrata, Athens was just bleeding out. Thousands were dead, the treasury was draining, and the male politicians were too stubborn and arrogant to negotiate peace. The situation was completely desperate.
So Aristophanes uses old comedy to pitch a radical, hilarious, and deeply tactical solution. Our title character is Lysistrata, and unlike the often mocked female characters in other ancient texts, she is portrayed as a highly capable, extraordinary strategist. She calls a massive meeting of women from the various warring Greek city-states.
We meet two crucial supporting characters here who frequently appear on exams. There's Kalanice, an Athenian who represents the comic voice of the ordinary woman. She likes her wine, she likes her comfort, and she's hesitant about rebellion.
Right.
And then there is Lampedo. She is the Spartan woman. Having an enemy Spartan agree to the plan is what makes this a powerful pan-Greek alliance.
So here is our plot code for Lysistrata meeting. Leads to oath, leads to Acropolis, leads to magistrate, leads to desertion, leads to Myrrhine, leads to herald, leads to reconciliation, leads to peace. Women meet, take oath, seize Acropolis, tease men, make peace.
Perfect. So Lysistrata pitches her grand strategy to stop the war. All the women are going to completely withhold sexual privileges from their husbands and lovers until the men sign a peace treaty.
A sex strike.
Yes, the women are terrified of this idea at first, but Lysistrata rallies them. They seal the deal with a solemn oath over a massive bowl of wine.
And they even solemnly swear off the infamous lioness on the cheese grater position, which just shows Aristophanes' trademark body humor.
It really does. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, what makes her brilliant isn't just the sex strike. It's that she implements a sophisticated, double-pronged military strategy. While the younger women go home to execute the sex strike, she deploys a chorus of old women to execute a tactical military maneuver. They seize control of the Acropolis.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I always just thought of this as a body sex comedy. But seizing the Acropolis is an economic masterstroke.
Oh, absolutely.
The Acropolis holds the state treasury. It's where the silver is kept. Lysistrata basically freezes the bank accounts of the military-industrial complex. Without that silver, the men literally cannot buy ores for their naval fleets or pay the mercenaries.
Yeah.
The war machine just loses its funding.
It is modern economic sanctions wrapped in a 5th century comedy. And of course, the male political establishment doesn't take this lightly. A chorus of old men arrives, carrying fire, planning to burn down the gates of the Acropolis.
Right.
But they are met by the chorus of old women carrying pitchers of water. The women easily defeat the men, dousing their fires. It's a very literal, physical battle of the sexes.
Then we get to the ultimate confrontation with male political authority, which is personified by the character known as the magistrate. He shows up with his police force, demanding the treasury silver to buy war supplies. He rants about how men are to blame for letting women get out of control and orders the doors broken down.
But Lysistrata steps forward and completely dismantles his political worldview. She explains the hidden mechanisms of war, how women suffer immensely watching their husbands leave for endless campaigns and seeing young women age at home childless, unable to marry because an entire generation of men has been wiped out.
It's surprisingly poignant.
It is. She argues that managing the complex fabric of a society is exactly like managing wool. It requires patience, cleansing of the dirt, and weaving people together, not just violently cutting them apart with swords.
And she humiliates the magistrate. She drapes her headdress over him, hands him a basket of wool, and declares that war is now women's business. She even dresses him up like a corpse ready for burial, telling him his violent political order is dead.
However, the resistance inside the Acropolis isn't perfectly smooth. Human nature kicks in, and the women become restless. They start trying to desert the strike using the most ridiculous pretexts, like claiming they desperately need to go home just to air out their fabrics on their beds. Lysistrata has to constantly restore discipline.
Which leads to arguably the most famous and funniest scene in the play, and a massive exam trap you need to know. It's the scene with a woman named Myrrhine and her husband, Canisius. Canisius shows up at the Acropolis, utterly frantic and desperate for his wife, and Lysistrata tells Myrrhine to go out there and psychologically torture the poor guy.
Marine agrees to have sex with him, but only if he promises to vote for peace. He is so frantic he agrees to anything, but Marine uses the mechanics of delay perfectly. She says they need a bed and runs away to get one. Then she comes back and says, oh, they need a mattress. Then she runs away for a pillow, then a blanket, then a flask of perfume.
She is just relentlessly stalling. She gets him completely agonizingly desperate, and then at the very last second, she locks herself back inside the Acropolis. It's hilarious, but it proves the strategy is having a devastating psychological effect on the men.
We see the ultimate proof when a Spartan herald arrives to request peace talks. Aristophanes makes the physical toll of the strike visually obvious. The herald arrives in a state of extreme physical desperation, awkwardly hidden inside his tunic.
Right.
The Athenian magistrate, who is in the exact same condition, quickly agrees that they need to negotiate peace immediately.
So they bring out the delegates, and to broker the peace, Lysistrata introduces a literal personified character named Reconciliation. The male delegates from both sides are so distracted by her that they finally stop fighting. Lysistrata scolds both Athens and Sparta for their past arrogance. They briefly squabble over the terms, but ultimately they sign the treaty. The war ends, the choruses of old men and old women unite, and the play ends in a massive, joyful celebration.
So let's map the sequential flow for Lysistrata, just like we did for the clouds. It starts with the meeting and the oath, which leads to seizing the Acropolis. They defeat the magistrate, overcome the temptations of desertion, highlighted by Myrrhine teasing Canisius, which forces the herald to arrive, leading to reconciliation, and finally, peace.
Let's synthesize these two massive works, because understanding this comparative breakdown is exactly what gets you top marks on the UGC NET. Aristophanes is attacking two very different institutions that were destroying his city.
Precisely. In the clouds, the problem is internal: debt and sophistic education. The institution attacked is the thinkery, representing false intellectualism that destroys objective truth. And it ends violently, with the school being attacked and burned. It's a very dark outcome.
Conversely, in Lysistrata, the problem is external, the Peloponnesian War. The institution being attacked is male political authority and military stubbornness. But unlike the dark ending of the clouds, the women's rebellion in Lysistrata ends with unity, celebration, and peace achieved.
If you are an exam aspirant, remember your core associations. The clouds is intrinsically linked to debt and wrong argument. Lysistrata is intrinsically linked to war and the sex strike. The genius of Aristophanes is how he used comedy, not just to make people laugh, but to force them to look at the ugliest parts of their society.
So what does this all mean? If you want to master the rest of the syllabus with this kind of thematic clarity, understanding not just what happened, but why it matters, you really must use British Literature Unlocked by Ankit Sharma. It is an absolute essential for UGC NET English preparation.
Definitely. So as we wrap up, let's lock in the end of session memory hacks. First, the clouds equals debt and wrong argument. Second, Lysistrata equals war and sex strike.
And let's return to the final chant. That thesis we started with: clouds corrupt argument, Lysistrata corrects war. That is the legacy of Aristophanes.
This raises an important question, though, doesn't it? It leaves you with a final thought to mull over. If Aristophanes were observing our modern world today, who would be the pseudo-intellectual suspended in a basket in his new thinkery? You know, optimizing for engagement over truth.
Oh, that's a great question.
And more importantly, what kind of collective, peaceful strike would it actually take to freeze our modern military-industrial complex and force political authorities to actually negotiate peace?
We are still navigating the exact same murky waters, aren't we?
Right.
The X-ray is still broken.
It really is.
Good luck on your exams.
Yeah.
Keep questioning the arguments around you, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.